So just for some perspective, let's start by reading our first text in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And for context, we'll go ahead and start back in verse 10. But really, we're going to be looking mainly here at verse 12. But we'll start for context in verse 10 of 2 Samuel 7. I will appoint a place for my people, Israel, and will plant them, that they may live in their own place and not be disturbed again, nor will the wicked afflict them any more as formerly. Even from the day that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord also declares to you that the Lord will make a house for you. When your days are complete, and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up for your descendant after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever, and your throne shall be established forever. So in accordance with all these words and all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. And as it's pointed out in our lesson material today, I think one of the really great benefits of taking a look at this prophecy is that it gives us a glimpse into the world of duality. How a prophecy can have kind of two fulfillments, two meanings behind it. One that is a little bit more immediate in nature, something that's a little closer, and then one that is also further away, one that's on the distant horizon. Two fulfillments. So just kind of giving just a bird's eye view then of 2 Samuel 7. What is the immediate fulfillment here? Or Solomon. Yeah. Solomon's kind of the immediate fulfillment of David, because obviously this is Nathan talking to David. That's what verse 17 clearly says. Nathan the prophet speaking to David. You're going to have a son. That son is going to inherit your throne. That son is going to build a house, he's going to build the temple, and he's going to have an enduring place on that throne. And, at least in a sense, all of those things were fulfilled in Solomon. You could almost stretch it a little further and say, not just Solomon, but David's posterity in a more general sense. That Solomon and good kings after that, and even bad kings in a sense, because they perpetuate the line of David as well, even though they didn't live righteously or uphold God's truth, they still perpetuated the line. So you could say David's descendants or David's posterity can fulfill this. But looking far away on the horizon, what is this prophecy really talking about? A little further down the road. Yeah, it's talking about Jesus. It's not about Jesus. So prophecies can have, I think, two fulfillments. Now, I will kind of acknowledge, with some hesitation, I suppose, that not everybody thinks that. I know personally preacher friends of mine who really, really believe doggedly that prophecies do not have duality, that a prophecy has one interpretation, one fulfillment, one purpose, and that it's kind of it's a problem for us to stretch those prophecies and try to fit two things into them. Though, I don't know, when you read Psalm 22, are there parts of Psalm 22 that really can't apply to Jesus? And are there parts of Psalm 22 that absolutely apply to Jesus? Yeah, and I think that's true of every prophecy. I think you can look at every messianic prophecy and you can see, well, there's aspects of it that don't appear to be Jesus. Just like here in 2 Samuel 7, if you talk about the Davidic line, the throne that will be established forever, a house that will be built in God's name, is that really fulfilled in Solomon and David's line? Yeah, kind of, materially speaking. But, I don't know. God has a pretty small view of things, or a pretty small perspective. If God thinks that, Rehoboam really fulfills this prophecy a whole lot, or, Ahaz. Does Ahaz really fulfill, is Manasseh really a part of this at all? I don't know. I think there has to be something bigger in mind than just Solomon. And even Solomon, for as great as he was, my personal assessment of Solomon is that Solomon was an absolute disappointment as a king. Considering everything that he had and everything that was available to him and all of the rich blessings that he had to start off with, he ends up being, I think, kind of a disappointment as a king who would live in God's image, who would live after God's will. It doesn't sit well with me when someone comes along and says 2 Samuel 7 is not a messianic prophecy, that is just talking about Solomon. I just think there's something grander going on. When you read this text, there's more here than just Solomon building a building that's eventually going to get destroyed and sitting on a throne that's eventually going to get passed on to the pagans, the Herods, the Gentile. There's more going on here than just that. And I do think that messianic prophecies can have dual fulfillment. One that's more immediate and one that's a little further down the road. So, kind of by way of just introduction, do you have any thoughts before we jump into verse 12 and look at some things more closely? Anything that you want to add to our introductory comments? Okay, look again a little closer at verse 12 then. When your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, look at that idea there. The message is given specifically to King David, and undoubtedly it refers to a time after David's death. I mean, that's what the prophecy, that's the time frame that's being given is, when your days are complete, when you lie down with your fathers, there's going to be a fulfillment of this that you're not going to see then. Maybe a practical application, without stepping too far away from the text, is, do we have the patience that when God seems to indicate this is not going to be fulfilled right now, do we have the patience to trust Him, to have faith? David is basically being told by God, I have something special planned for your descendants, and you're not going to get to see it. You know, lesser people might have looked at that and gone, really, God? Why say that? Why introduce the idea then? Why? It's a teaser. You're just being a tease then, God. You're getting me all excited about something that I'm not even going to get to see in my life. What is a New Testament passage that sort of gives you that same idea of people who trust in God, who have faith in God, but who never physically, materially get to see the promise fulfilled? Where's a New Testament passage that reminds you of that? Of people who have faith. Yeah, Hebrews 11. Yeah, there you go. Like, I can't throw you anything more than that. Hebrews chapter 11. You remember what it says there, speaking of people like Abraham and Sarah in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13. All of these died in faith without receiving the promises. Abraham never got to see descendants like the sand of the seashore or the stars of the heavens. Okay, he never got to see that. A lot of other greats also never got to see it. Moses only got to see the land of promise from a distance on top of a mountain. He never got to step foot in it. He never got to feel what it was like to cross the Jordan River on dry ground and into the land of Canaan. Moses never got to see that. They died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Those who say such things make it clear they're seeking a country of their own, and indeed if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they seek a better country. That's what they're looking for. They're seeking a heavenly one. So God's not ashamed to call them His own because of that. And I think this indirectly applies to David as well. David's given a promise, and the very beginning of the promise is, after you're dead. After you're dead. You're not going to get to see this, but after you're dead, something's going to happen. One writer put it really well. John Davis here in The Birth of a Kingdom said this of some of the specifics of this prophecy. He said, and this is in your notes, by the way, the Davidic covenant was a very important affirmation of God's intention to complete that which He had promised to Abraham in Genesis 12. This covenant consisted of three essential elements. One, a posterity. Two, a throne. And three, a kingdom. The nature and scope of this covenant are such that their fulfillment could not have been realized in the days of Solomon. And that's what I'm talking about, is when you read this, yes, it's talking about Solomon. But isn't something bigger in view here than just Solomon? He goes on to say, they'll find their ultimate fulfillment in Christ through the establishment of his kingdom. Barry Kercheval made a really good point. Barry Kercheval was talking about a couple of years ago when he did a gospel meeting in Abilene. He was talking about the way that sometimes we get really narrow in our thinking of the promise to Abraham. And we believe that everything was completely and totally and utterly fulfilled just in like the land promise. That Abraham's descendants got the land of Canaan and the land promise is done. It's finished. It's wiped away. And Barry Kercheval just kind of put it in perspective, like, think about this. Especially when you compare Israel to her contemporaries, her peers, other kingdoms, empires of the world at the time, even at its height, even under Solomon, you're talking about a pretty mid-tier kingdom. Now, Solomon was famous for his wisdom, and Solomon had a lot of wealth. But Solomon, even at his highest, was still kind of a, mid-level king. He was a mid-level king. And so it's kind of narrow for us to look at the promise to Abraham and hear the promise to David and go, oh yeah, that was fulfilled in Solomon. Well, I don't know about that. Doesn't God have a larger scope, something bigger in view, a grander purpose to these things than just a kingdom that really at its height might have been a little smaller than the state of Arizona? I mean, doesn't God have something bigger in mind here for David and his line than just Solomon? Anyway, I just think that's just, you can't stretch it too far. You don't want to push it too hard. But I think there's more going on here than just that. So, I will raise up a descendant after you, goes on to say in verse 12. I'll raise up a descendant after you. Referring back to this previous quotation by Davis, we see the first portion of the covenant. Through the line of David, future kings would come to rule over Judah. We know from history, of course, you read 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and you know who tended to have the more righteous line of kings. Judah, yeah. You can't hardly even say Israel had a line of kings because the line was constantly being interrupted and then replaced with another line. You had dynasties. Even dynasty is a little bit too grand of a term for some of the houses of the kings of Israel. But you'd have 2-3 generations maybe in a line of kings, and then they'd all be killed by Jehu, and then they'd move on and somebody else would fit. That wasn't even really a line. And for the most part, they were pretty awful. Ahab had one glorious moment where it seems that near the end of his life, Ahab felt some remorse for the things that he did. Jehu was okay in that he fulfilled the will of God, but he did it and was pretty wicked afterward. Jeroboam II probably wasn't the worst king Israel had, but when you compare those kings to guys like Josiah and Hezekiah, Uzziah, when you compare it to guys like Jehoshaphat, there's some really good kings in Judah. And that's David's line. What a posterity. To know that, there were some bad eggs mixed in there. You had the Manassehs and you had the Ahazes mixed in there as well. But what a posterity to know that your descendants were guys like Hezekiah, and your descendants were guys like Uzziah, and your descendants were those sorts of people. Practical application is, what sort of framework and foundation have you laid in your life so that your descendants live that kind of life as well? You can't control their choices, obviously. But there's a big difference in terms of the teaching and the foundations that were laid in the lives of men like David, in the lives of men like Jehoshaphat, in the lives of men like Josiah. There's a big difference between kind of the framework in which they lived their lives and the lives of Ahab. Ahab did not have a moral framework aside from whatever Jezebel told him he should do. And you can see the difference in the way those families, the way those kingdoms parted ways, morally speaking. Any thoughts there on verse 12? Alan, did you have a thought? Sorry. Oh, David.
I think we've got to keep in mind that these prophecies, if you want to talk about a dual process, is physical on the one hand and spiritual on the other.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. And of course, we also have to acknowledge that there's, it almost kind of goes both ways, though, because I would say that for everything spiritual about this being fulfilled in Jesus, there was it was physical as well. You have to realize that Jesus was literally, genetically, a descendant of David. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I think that's a good overall way to look at it, is kind of a physical fulfillment and a spiritual. But even the spiritual fulfillments tended to have like a real physical component to them. Think about the duality in the book of Isaiah. When Isaiah is talking to King Ahaz, and of course Ahaz is terrified. He's terrified of Damascus. He's terrified of Samaria. He's scared of all of his enemies to the north, including Assyria. And Isaiah comes to Ahaz and says, there's going to be a child born to a virgin. Now, there's an immediate application there, and you read there, the rest of the chapter, and then the next chapter. Even Isaiah himself has a child there. There's a point there. But was Jesus literally born of a virgin? Yeah. So yes, that fulfilled that prophecy. Is that Isaiah 7? Somebody who's got that a little bit more in mind than me. I was just studying Isaiah chapter 7. Yeah, obviously Isaiah chapter 7 is talking about somebody being born in Ahaz's time period. But it's also talking about a virgin who's going to be with child much later down the road as well. And there was a spiritual as well as a physical component to that as well. Verse 12, it goes on to say, I'll establish a kingdom. I will establish his kingdom. Who establishes the kingdom? Yeah, God does. I will establish his kingdom. If you're not giving God credit for establishing a kingdom, you're building the wrong kingdom. Next phrase here. I will raise up for you to send after you who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. Verse 13 of our text. He shall build a house for my name. So, was this literally fulfilled in Solomon? Yeah. He does go on to build a house. David knows that he's not allowed to build the house. Why? Why can't David build a house? Yeah, man of war. Too much blood on his hands. God's not interested in that, in an association of his holy house and his holy name being associated with so much bloodshed. Even though, for the most part, it was bloodshed for a divine purpose, it was nevertheless dirty work that David had to do in his life, and it just wasn't appropriate to connect to those things, to associate them with the house of that God wanted to have built. And yet, even with all this being said, that Solomon literally built a temple, he literally built a house for the name of God, could that house have ever truly housed God's name or his glory? What was God's own assessment of a temple being built? Can you build a house? Yeah, Brian?
Yeah, he would say of himself that nothing that they could ever build would ever house him.
Yeah.
So it's not that he needed this temple or he required it. It was the people who wanted it and wanted to build it. So
yeah,
that's kind of the idea that he gave even to David when David wanted to build it.
Yeah, and it's not for me, This, you can't build a house that can contain me. You remember in Acts chapter 17 when Paul's talking to the Athenians. He mentions there to the Athenians that God does not need anything from us. God is not served by human hands as if he needs anything from us. What kind of house can you build that would contain the glory of God? What kind of idol could you build that would be truly a representation of God? And even Solomon's house that he built for God, again, as impressive as it probably was, gold plated and all with the marble and everything like that, as impressive as it probably was, it was still a pile of materials that God created. Isn't that kind of funny to think about? How Solomon gave his very best, as he ought to have. Solomon gave his very best to build a temple, and God is looking down at that temple going, it's one tiny grain of sand on a planet that I created. And it's sweet, though. I mean, you know, when you have your kids, and your kids want to go like build a lemonade stand, like I want to, and you want to encourage them, the enterprise, the entrepreneurship. You want to encourage them in that. So you go to Home Depot and you buy $50 worth of material, put together a lemonade stand, go to the grocery store, get $20 worth of material to actually make the lemonade, and then it's your water bill that's providing the water. And they sell lemonade for 25 cents, and they make a profit of $1.20. And they're like, Dad, I made $3 today selling lemonade. And you're like, good for you. That's good for you. I always wondered if God is like, with his temple that Solomon built, God is like, good for you, Solomon. Not in a patronizing way, but because it's sweet. God made the whole earth. All that gold, all the cedars of Lebanon, all the marble, the basin that was made, all the candelabra, everything that Solomon made, and God's going, good for you. I made all of that originally. I created all of that. There's no house that can be built. So that's why I say when we look at this prophecy that yes, there is a short-term fulfillment in Solomon building the temple. But is that the only house that's really being talked about here? Let's look at a couple verses. They're both in your notes here. In Ephesians chapter 2. I want 2 volunteers here, and we'll pass the mic around. First, Ephesians 2, 19 through 22. Who's got that for me? Ephesians 2, 19 through 22. If no one volunteers, I'm making Ryan Billington do it. Okay, Billington. Ephesians 2, 19 through 22. And then the other one is 1 Corinthians 3, 10 through 17. Who's got that one? If no one volunteers, Mike Abney has to do it. Dennis volunteered. Okay, so as soon as Ryan's done reading, just bring the mic right over to Dennis and do 1 Corinthians 3, 10 through 17. Okay, Dennis? Go ahead, Ryan.
Now, therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and the members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit.
Thank you. Notice there, is God's main concern with actual buildings, actual stones, actual foundations? There's something bigger that he has in mind. Go ahead, Dennis, 1 Corinthians 3.
According to the grace of God, which was given to me like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation and another is building on it. But each man must be careful how he builds on it. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will be evident, for the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire, and the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work which has built on its remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as though fire. Do you not know that you are a temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, and that is what we are.
So, and again, I know it's easy for us to say, we have the hindsight, we are New Testament people. We have the hindsight of looking back at a prophecy given and a prophecy fulfilled. So I I don't mean to intimate at all that we're any smarter than David was, that we have some incredible amount of insight. What I'm just saying is it's important for us to see there's more going on here than just Solomon building a temple. That's, I think, the key here to this prophecy is, yes, a house will be built, but Nebuchadnezzar's captain, he's going to burn that thing down. He's going to tear down the entire city of Jerusalem brick by brick, including the temple. That temple is not going to last forever. There has to be something more that this prophecy is talking about than just a building. Brian, you had a thought?
I always find it interesting just how, the shadow of the old law and how it was a schoolmaster for the people, and you really do see a lot of similarities in this structure that God gave direction to build, and today in the church. And if God gave all of the direction that He gave and all of the specificity and everything else that He demanded that would glorify Him and lift up His name on the earth at that time, that sort of makes our work today as the temple, as this kingdom of His name, sort of even more, it kind of gives even more importance to what we're supposed to be about today.
That's a very good point, Brian. Even though I think Christians have this tendency to look back almost with a sort of an arrogance, that we're the fulfillment, we're the spiritual, we're the actual fulfillment, and yet in Solomon's way, Solomon gave his whole heart to this project. He gave more devotion and attention to detail and zeal and religious fervor to building a building than we sometimes do to what is supposed to be the grand fulfillment of the prophecy. It's almost like, we have the greater task of being the temple of God. Solomon just had the shadow. But Solomon poured everything he had into that shadow, and we don't always pour everything we have into the substance. And that's a shame on us. That's a shame on us when we observe that, I think, as Solomon's life played out. So anyway, in the book of Hebrews, of course, Hebrews chapter 5, Brian, is exactly what you're talking about. Is, it's the shadow. We are the substance. How are you applying yourself then to something that's supposed to be the substance? And Mike, I know you had your hand up a few minutes ago. Did it pass by or? Oh, okay. All right. See, we just steamrolled you. Sorry, Mike. His feelings are hurt. Go ahead, Dale.
Also, as the shadow, you might say, well, that building back there wasn't all that important, and they just did it because they did it, and it was there, and it wasn't. But It was very important that they build it exactly as they were supposed to, because it was a shadow of the one in heaven.
Yes.
And so if you mess that one up, you don't understand what's coming.
Yeah.
And so you talk about these prophecies, they may not have recognized what the house looked like if they hadn't built the temple and built it properly and correctly and done everything the right way. So it in itself was a schoolmaster. It was a training session for them to help them recognize what was to come.
And, these folks in Ephesians 2 and 1 Corinthians 3, having some material guidepost, I think made those passages in Ephesians 2 and 1 Corinthians 3 really come to life. If you don't know what a temple looks like, when Paul says to you, you're the temple of God, you don't have a frame of reference for understanding that. If you don't have any idea what a foundation is, what stones look like, what a cornerstone is. That's Sterling's favorite thing. In a year here at Monte Vista, his favorite thing that he's learned in Bible class is cornerstones. That's still his big thing he talks about all the time is cornerstones. He looks at an old building and says, Daddy, is that the cornerstone? I said, yes, son, that is. He's very excited about cornerstones. But if you don't know what a cornerstone is, literally, then it doesn't mean anything to you to talk about a cornerstone symbolically. So, the temple of God had a valuable place. Solomon put his whole heart into it, and the people poured their hearts into the service of the temple. Well, at various times in their history, of course, we know that there was superficial worship that happened quite a bit. Read, Amos or Micah, for example, for some, insight into the superficial worship of their time. But I still think that's a good points that we're making. I appreciate that comment, Dale. Then he goes on to say, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, in a sense, you could see the forever as being more of a general term than a literal term. Because was the line of David established on its throne forever, like eternally? No. I mean, you get to Zerubbabel and it's kind of like it's over. You get to the end of 2 Chronicles, and there's not a whole lot of hope after 2 Chronicles that they're going to be reestablishing the line of David anytime on the throne in Jerusalem. And even when they did have kings after that, those kings were certainly not literally of the line of David. All those Herods, the Herods were basically just Gentiles in disguise more than anything else. They weren't the line of David. Where did the line of David end up? Physically. Yeah, in Christ. In Nazareth. Well, yeah, that's it. Like, they're not sitting on a throne. Okay, they're living in Galilee of all places, and we've poked fun at Galilee before because it's the truth. Galilee was the boonies of the time. Galilee was the rough area. It was where you had the blue collar workers in Galilee. Galilee was not a real exciting place to be from. And so the line of David went from sitting on a throne in Jerusalem to a prison cell in Babylon to being a nobody in Galilee. That's where David's line went. So when we read here in 2 Samuel 7 that I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever, that can't be talking about Solomon. That can't be talking about the physical line of David sitting on a literal throne in Jerusalem. Which kind of is a gut punch to premillennialism, isn't it? It's a gut punch to Zionism, the idea that in order for Jesus to come back in judgment, then Jerusalem actually the whole idea of premillennialism just doesn't fit in with these messianic prophecies, just plain and simple. So, discussion question here on page 13. Do you ever find it hard to reconcile the words of this prophecy and others as well with the literal historical outcome of Jewish history? And I guess more of the discussion question is this. How do you, in your mind, reconcile the apparent discrepancies between the grand language in the prophecy and the rather humble, literal, physical outcome of Jewish history, especially in the captivity and then eventually the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70? How do you reconcile those? Because 2 Samuel 7, that's pretty lofty language. Thrones forever, glorious house in my name, and he'll be a king forever. That's really lofty language to think about people in Babylon living in captivity, isn't it? So how do you reconcile those things? Well, I will admit, I put you on the spot. A lot of this is what we've already talked about, is literalizing versus seeing the spiritual side of things. Where's your fulfillment actually coming in? What kind of throne are you talking about? Actual thrones, a chair covered in gold, or the seat of authority? Go ahead, Ryan.
We also see in the line of the kings that there's conditional. If this were a worldly kingdom, if it were everything that they wanted here in these prophecies, they couldn't fulfill their end of the bargain anyway. It was somewhat conditional.
Yeah. Hey, and that's a good point also. There's conditions that are placed on it. There's a lot of ifs in the prophets, isn't there? There's in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, there's a lot of ifs. If you do this, if you do that. Jeremiah 18. If a nation decides to do good, then I'll treat it that way. If a nation decides to do evil, I will relent concerning the good that I had decided. There's a lot of ifs built into there. If you abide in my name, if you do what I say, it all goes back to Deuteronomy 17, doesn't it? Deuteronomy 17 is a passage that talks about someday you're going to have kings. I appreciate that God knew long before Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 8. God knew long before that the people of Israel would whine and complain and want a king. Deuteronomy 17 is evidence of that. He knew all the way back in Deuteronomy 17, someday you're going to have a king. Just make sure that when you do have a king, that he doesn't accumulate horses, that he doesn't accumulate wealth to a ridiculous degree, and that he knows the law, that he writes down his own personal copy of the law before he's allowed to become king. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, verse 14, he says, if he commits iniquity, I'll chasten him with the rod of men, with the blows of the sons of men, but my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed before you, and your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. So it's kind of that idea. There are conditions here, and if he doesn't fulfill his end of the bargain, then the kingdom will be taken away.
Yeah.
He'll still have mercy, but the kingdom, he'll be chastened, he'll be rebuked for it. And that's kind of what you see in the line of the kings. They stopped following after God, so their physical kingdom was taken away from them in a sense, but the mercy that God had was always still there. And that's what you see all throughout prophetic writings too, that God's mercy would extend to his son, who would then establish this new kingdom that was everlasting. So it's kind of that, that those conditions are even still here, even in this passage that we're reading here.
Good point. And you do see that played out in their history as well. By the time of Josiah, who was really the last good king, Josiah in Judah, who was the most noteworthy contemporary prophet in the time of Josiah? Jeremiah. Jeremiah was the biggest name prophet in the time of Josiah. And when you read Jeremiah's prophecy, is there a lot of optimism there? Think of it. He's living in the time of Josiah, which Josiah's story says that there was never a Passover as awesome as the one under Josiah. So Jeremiah is living in a time of spiritual and religious and political reform with a good king named Josiah, and even in Jeremiah's prophecies, God is basically saying, it's too late. It's too late. Not even Josiah is enough to convince me to keep Judah around a whole lot longer. And isn't that really interesting to just think that even a good king like Josiah could not counterbalance the damage that had already been done by his father and his grandfather and those who'd come before him. Their fate was sealed. They chose to live unrighteously, to follow the ways of the Babylonians, to follow the ways of the pagans. They made that choice, and even Josiah's reforms were temporary and probably superficial, because as soon as Josiah dies, where does the kingdom go? Yeah. So I think it's interesting to see it played out. That's a really good point, Brian. I appreciate that. Are you running for someone had a comment? Oh, okay. I didn't even see your hand up there, Mike.
So we're talking about, I like the spiritual and physical part of both of these things. So we're talking about forever, and how long is that eternity? And so how long can David's throne reign?
Mm-hmm.
He's physical.
Yeah.
And we're talking about eternal. So we used Hebrews already, and if we go over a few more verses in Hebrews, or chapters in Hebrews 12, there the Hebrew writer is talking about God and the mountain, the people being in fear. But I'm going to drop down a little bit and just read a verse that says, "Now this, even more, indicates the removal of all those things being shaken as of the things that are made, that the things which can be shaken will not remain. Therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we have served God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire." So the point is earth passes away. Jesus said everything goes away. There is a kingdom that will be established forever. I like Dale's thought of the temple. If we go back in a little bit in Hebrews, it talks about what the temple was for to go and do. Yeah. And it's like the temple, but in those passages in Hebrews, he brought out the blood of bulls and goats cannot save us. but
Yeah.
it's our priesthood. It's our righteousness to God.
Yeah, very good point. I appreciate that. Which I kind of think that leads into the next verse. We got to go to verse 14 here. We're running out of time. I'll be a father to him, he'll be a son to me, but when he commits iniquity. All right, at that point you're going, okay, that part's not messianic. And again, that's why I pointed to Psalm 22. Psalm 22, I feel like, has kind of a similar feel to this. Clearly, I don't think anybody would argue that the majority of Psalm 22 is looking forward to the time on the cross. And yet the first few verses here, really, in verse 6, for example, I'm a worm and not a man. I don't know if Jesus ever thought of himself as a worm and not a man. The last few verses from 25 and onward, there's aspects of this that just don't apply to Jesus. Not all of Psalm 22 is messianic. Not all of 2 Samuel 7 is messianic. So we are having a view now of Solomon. Okay, if Solomon does not obey, if Rehoboam doesn't obey, you go on down the line. If these guys don't obey, what's going to happen? Well, I'll correct him with the rod of discipline. I'll correct him. And he comes out very clearly, he says, the rod of men, the strokes of the sons of men. I think he's saying, I will use human intervention. I will use the Assyrians. I'll use armies from Damascus. I'll use the Philistines. I'll use physical enemies to chastise kings who are not living righteously. Woo! And Ahaz really got it, didn't he? Woo. Ahaz got it in spades, too. He had Samaria and Damascus coming down on him. And where did he go? Instead of trusting in God, what did he do instead? He bought Assyria. He bought stock in Assyria. And then Assyria saved him from Samaria and Damascus and turned around and hurt him for it. Ahaz got everything that he deserved, and he was chastised because of it. A lot of them went through that chastisement. Uzziah, he was not chastised with enemies necessarily, but when Uzziah went to the temple and started parading around, wanted to tinker around with temple objects, what happened to King Uzziah? Leprosy. Yeah, he was as white as a leper the rest of his life, and actually had to live in separate quarters. And his son was Joram? It was either Jotham or Joram. You know how it is. Too many, and they all shared names. Kings of Israel and kings of Judah. Some are Jehoram and some are Jotham. They like to share names. Ahaziah, a couple of those thrown in there. Yeah, his son actually had to co-rule while he was living in a house by himself because of his leprosy. So you see the chastisement in a lot of their lives, these kings, and that literally came to pass. Let's go ahead and move on now. I want to skip on down to the next page, and let's look at our next. Let's look at our next prophecy, because I want to make sure we've got a little bit of time here to look at this one. So go to the book of Zechariah. I know you're all spending a lot of time in Zechariah in your Bible studying, right? Zechariah is a fun book. There's some cool stuff. There's some creepy stuff in Zechariah too. There's some scary stuff in that book. But in Zechariah chapter 6, I want to kind of focus in on a prophecy that is very similar in language and is looking forward to a similar fulfillment. That fulfillment in the house and the throne and everything being established in Christ. So let's read here. Let me get a volunteer. If somebody would like to read for me, Zechariah 6, verses 12 through 13. And actually, I will say, let's go through verse 15. We won't be able to get to everything, but if you go to the end of the chapter, 12 through the end of the chapter is going to give you some really cool context here that I think might be worth talking about if we have some time. Go ahead, Chuck.
Then say to him, Thus says the Lord of hosts, Behold a man whose name is Branch, for he will branch out from where he is, and he will build the temple of the Lord. Yes, it is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he who will bear the honor and sit and rule on his throne. Thus he will be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace will be between the two offices. Now the crown will become a reminder in the temple of the Lord to Helem, Tobijah, Jedai, and
Have fun with that.
yeah, thanks. And Han, the son of Zephaniah. And those who are far off will come and build the temple of the Lord. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you, and it will take place if you completely obey the Lord your God.
Now, was there a short-term fulfillment to this? You can see it played out in the reconstruction of the temple after the Babylonian captivity. That to me that's the story where if the Israelites or the Hebrews of this time were looking for a fulfillment closer, rebuilding the temple, reestablishing Jerusalem, seeing the office, especially of priest, kind of reestablished and put back in place. I think you could see a lot of fulfillment literally in history in the Reconstruction period in Jerusalem. But again, there's something more. Something more is going on here, and we have the awesome advantage of hindsight to see how it's played out. So what do you think of this name, the branch? What do you think of someone will come and his name will be Branch? What do you think that means? What is a branch? Okay, a shoot? Yeah, something that shoots off. And it's a connector as well. I think that's an important point. It's a connector. If you have from the root of a tree to the apple hanging at the end of the branch, that branch is the connection. Without the branch, are apples just going to sprout up? No, apples don't just pop up out of the ground. Tomatoes don't just pop up out of the ground. Vine. Jesus is the vine. We read that in the Gospel of John. I am the true vine, okay? I'm the vine dresser. I mean, he's all of it. So this idea of branch is a connection. It's an interesting thing also. The word Nazareth means branch. What? You're all going, what? Yeah. It's just neat stuff like that. It's just those kinds of cool connections to see there. I'll have a servant, his name will be Branch. And yeah, he's the branch that connects us to God. But he's also Nazareth. So there's a connection there to a prophecy being fulfilled. At least I see that prophecy being fulfilled there, at least in a small sense of him being from Nazareth as his hometown. So I think that's really cool. I really, really like the way that plays out. And obviously the application is to Christ. Let's pick up some other things here. This term branch. Some other texts where branch is also used. We'll read these real quick here because I think it's worth spending some time pointing out. But first, go ahead. We got it. Oh, get the mic up there. Sorry about that.
I have a question about where it says, "He shall build the temple of the Lord."
Yeah, go ahead, Joan.
Is capitalized.
Yeah.
And also, the man whose name is Branch, it's capitalized, M. From his place, he, those are all capital letters.
Yeah.
Is that original in the?
No, that's editors,
Okay.
Capitalization is something that's been added by editors.
But they feel like it's a messianic prophecy too, or they wouldn't have done that,
yeah,
right?
no. Yeah,
Okay.
Editors who come along and capitalize, because you have to understand, they didn't punctuate and capitalize the way that we do. They didn't have quotation marks and all that. So there's a lot of these, conventions that have been added. But editors of, I think, every translation that I've ever noticed who do capitalize the personal pronouns of God do it. Alan, am I correct in remembering that New English, is it New English Standard that you like? Yes. English Standard, yeah. Am I correct in remembering that ESV does not do the capitalized personal pronouns?
They don't.
They don't. So it's not all of them. New American Standard, New King James, NIV, I think, does capitalized personal pronouns for God. So in translations that do that, Zechariah 6 is always capitalized. Unless you're reading, heathenist texts like ESV, in which case they don't believe that Jesus was God or that he's deserving of a capitalized he. But yeah, that's Joan, I'm glad you pointed that out, because It's an Old Testament prophecy that the editors have clearly seen. We're talking about Jesus here. We're talking about deity in these verses. Yeah, it could be fulfilled a little bit in those who rebuilt the temple, in a sense. But again, there's something bigger going on here. And coupled with all of these other prophecies about the branch should be, here's your little tip. If you're reading through Isaiah and you see the word branch, the light should go off. Sirens sounding. Get out your highlighters, get out your cross-reference. If you see the word branch in the prophets of the Old Testament, time to pay attention. Okay? Let's read a few of them here. Isaiah 4, verse 2. And I'll just read them real quick here, just for the sake of time, because I think it's worth pointing out the way this appears. Look at the way the word branch is here. Isaiah 4, verse 2. In that day, the branch, and that word branch is capitalized, New American Standard, in Isaiah 4:2. The branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth will be the pride and the adornment of the survivors of Israel. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 10, which I actually think is one of the prophecies that we're going to be looking at later on. So we probably don't need to spend too much time here. No, actually, I did not include that one in this. I think I've written material for it if you're curious. But in Isaiah 11, verse 1, then a shoot, which is Nazareth, same word there, for branch. So the translators just decided to include the word shoot instead of branch there. But it's that same word, Nazareth. Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, of counsel and strength, the spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. This is the Messiah here, pretty clearly. Jeremiah 23 and verse 5. Pull that one up here. Jeremiah 23, verse 5. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. That's almost begging you to go back to 2 Samuel 7, isn't it? It's begging you to go back to 2 Samuel 7. This is fulfillment. This is a promise that was made to David, that your descendants will sit on that throne. Your descendant will have a throne and a kingdom that will be established forever. And it's not Solomon, and it's not Rehoboam, and it's not even Josiah or Hezekiah or anybody else. Your descendant, Jesus, is going to have a throne and a kingdom that will be established forever. Jeremiah 33, verse 15 is the last one we'll look at here. Jeremiah 33 and verse 15. In those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch of David to spring forth, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the earth. And in those days Judah shall be saved. Again, that's clearly a messianic prophecy. All this foreshadowing, speaking of Jesus. Brian, go ahead.
I was going to say at the end of sort of this summary here in Zechariah, how he talks about not only is he going to rule and sit on his throne in verse 13, so he shall be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace will be between them both. Mm-hmm. And that specifically right there was not allowed for the line of David.
Not kosher.
Right? That office was not the responsibility of the line of David. That was obviously the Levitical priesthood. They were the ones to be set up in that office as priest. So clearly here this is not all physical, and it's the book of Hebrews obviously talks a lot about this subject as well, but it kind of gives in this picture that somebody is going to be a king and a priest at the same time. Mm-hmm. So they need to be looking maybe more beyond the physical line of what they're used to looking at as the kingship.
That's a good point. I like that. They're without excuse. When the experts in the prophets were studying this in the first century, and they came across Zechariah 6, it should have set off, again, a buzzer or something that says, wait a minute, the two offices, there will be peace between them. He'll be a priest and a king. That instantly should have made those experts go, I don't know if that sounds right to me. We can't be talking physical here. Hebrews chapter 7 goes out of its way to point out that Jesus could not have been a priest after the line of Aaron. He goes out of it. He goes all the way back to Genesis 14 to Melchizedek to point out that Jesus could not have been a priest after the line of Aaron, but he's a priest after his own order. It's clear that Jesus came from the line of Judah, from David. Where do priests come from? Levi. Yeah. Pretty interesting here. And I think that's also where the branch comes in. That idea of a branch, he's a connector. He's not just a connector between God and man, he's also a branch between two normally irreconcilable offices. Things that could not have coexisted in one person. Jesus is a branch that connects two normally irreconcilable things. So that branch has several meanings to it then, doesn't it? I just love this idea of he's a branch, he's a connector, he connects all these things. God and man could never have anything to do with each other. The priest and the king could not have been filled by one person. And yet Jesus does the impossible by being the branch between those things.
Break from the normal or break from the standard as well.
Yes. Yeah, break from the normal. It's a break from the standard. It stands out. Jesus, and we're going to look at Melchizedek later, so we'll kind of hold off on that. We're going to look at Genesis 14 and Psalm 110 and Hebrews chapter 7, so we'll try not to step on that too much. But we'll talk about Melchizedek also and the part that Jesus plays as being a priest after the line of Melchizedek here. So let's focus in again here. Let's go back to Zechariah 6 with our just last few minutes. There is that glare on that clock. Is it about time to end? Is it 5:30? 1 minute? Okay. We'll kind of wrap things up here with this idea here that he'll build my temple. Back in verse 13. It is he who will build the temple of the Lord. If somebody was reading 2 Samuel 7, and they're reading about a son of David building a house for my name, and all they thought was Solomon building the temple. And then they come across Zechariah 6, which was written hundreds of years later, still prophesying a yet-to-happen event. Has this temple been built? No, it is he who will build the temple of the Lord. That temple has not been built yet. Whatever, and I think he's going back to 2 Samuel 7, whatever the temple was that was predicted in 2 Samuel 7, the house that shall be for my name, it still hasn't been built yet by the time of Zechariah 6. He's still looking forward saying, we still are waiting for that temple, that house to be built. And who's going to build it? Well, it wasn't Solomon. Solomon's been dead for 400 years. Who's going to build it? The branch. That branch is going to come. The same branch that you read about in Isaiah, the same branch that you read about in Jeremiah, that branch will come and he will build my temple. The counsel of peace will be between those two offices. And as a king, he gives counsel with perfect law, according to Robert Harkrider. And that's really important to point out there, that he's going to be not only the giver of a perfect law, but he'll also be the counselor of the perfect law. He'll be the instrument of justice in that perfect law. So any final thoughts then? Any final thoughts that you have here about Zechariah 6? Okay, really appreciate your comments this evening. These are really cool texts, aren't they? They're challenging. They really get us to start thinking, and maybe these are texts that we just haven't really studied before, and you read them and you go, that's really cool to see the way they're all connected with each other. Well, thanks for your comments.